This slide cast we're going to look at standards, which is a particular type of specification. So a standard is a specification formally approved by an organisation, also known as a standard specification. So most engineering work we do is repetitive. You build a road, you build another road, you build it much the same. And what happens is industry develops a way of doing things. An organisation that's responsible for building roads will have over time developed the most efficient way of that they want roads to be built, and so they will set that out in a standard. You can reference those standards in the specification. You don't have to write them out, you don't have to do a cut and paste. If you reference them, they become part of the contract document. So if you're building a highway, for example, you would reference the Transit New Zealand specifications standards for particular parts of it. So for example, if you're specifying the base course to be used on a state highway, then you would reference Transit New Zealand's base course aggregate standard, which is TNZB2, for example. So commonly used reference standards, there's New Zealand standards, and this is an organisation, an industry organisation, and it draws on people from all parts of industry, so contractors, suppliers, manufacturers, the consultants, and they all get together and they prepare these standards, which is industry best practice. Government organisations such as Transit New Zealand, now known as NZTA, the Department of Conservation have their own standards, for example. And councils have their own engineering standards. So a council, say a local council, will say this is the way we want pipelines laid in our particular area. In Auckland, there's several council organisations. So Auckland Council has a Transportation Auckland Transportation, and their job is to build all the roads in Auckland. They've got Watercare, who are responsible for the water and wastewater services in Auckland, and they both have a set of standards which say how they want their particular things to be built. So Watercare says what sort of materials are acceptable for pipelines, how they're to be installed, how they're to be inspected, how they're to be tested, for example. So New Zealand standards are produced by Standards New Zealand. They are normally coded like this. So NZS 3114 1987 concrete surface finishes. So that's an example of a New Zealand standard. NZS stands for New Zealand Standard. Sometimes you see AS/NZS, that means Australian/NZS, Australian Standard/New Zealand Standard, which means that Australians and New Zealanders have got together and it's a joint standard applicable in both Australia and New Zealand. 3114, that number there, is the standard number. As each standard is produced, they give it another number, so it doesn't relate to anything other than the order in which it has been prepared. So you can have a standard 3114 close to a standard that's about, say, valves or something like that. So there's no order in which those numbers are arranged except chronologically. 1987 is the year of the issue or revision. Oftentimes these standards will be issued at a particular time and then they'll be reviewed on an ongoing basis, and each review will make subtle changes, and that's what that date is. So you need to look at the date, make sure you've got the most current standard. And then there's the title, Concrete Surfaces Finished, describes the work item. So it's compiled by a committee of industry experts. The suppliers, the manufacturers, the designers, the constructors all get together in the same room and decide on the best way to, in this case, provide finishes to concrete. It is the best practice. These are the experts. They say this is how it should be done. And as I said, Standards New Zealand works with Australian standards, so joint standards AS, NZS are just as valid as just the New Zealand standards. Government organisations who are responsible for providing engineering products, they will also have their own standards. So the New Zealand Transportation Authority is responsible for the state highways. If you go to this site here, you can have a look at it. They've got hundreds of standards for the roading aggregates, the guardrail types, the way that you're supposed to install a road, everything. They also reference the Austroads, which is their opposite number. So Austroads is responsible for developing standards for Australian roads, and New Zealand is a member of that Austroads, and so they also look at New Zealand roads as well. Department of Conservation, Department of Building and Housing put out the building code, which says the standards for structures built in New Zealand. So here's an extract from NZS B2 about granular pavement, so base course. So that starts off with a scope saying what it's all about, then it starts talking about specific terms. So let's look at an example here. Should any potholes, ravelling, or faults develop, the affected area shall be made good by the contractor to the extent that existing. So what it's talking about is the contractor is responsible for repairing any potholes. Councils are also responsible for their own work done in their particular city or district. If you build a road or install a pipeline, oftentimes that'll be handed over to the council at the end of the project for public use. So they want the whatever is built to be up to an appropriate standard, because the cost of fixing broken roads or whatever is the council's after it's been handed over. So they want to make sure that it's up to the appropriate standard. So these standards they issue can be called engineering standards, environmental standards, development standards, infrastructure design standards. All mean the same thing. This is the way we want this infrastructure constructed. So here's an example from the infrastructure design standards. It's got a list, so you can see that there's a section about stormwater, about wastewater, about water, eroding. So they split it into those different components, different trades. And so a section from section 7, water supply, it's talking about the appropriate size of the mains, what sort of material can be used. Now this is the Christchurch standard. So after the earthquake, they went through and they changed the standard, and this is a markup. So what they've done here is they've gone and made a change, and they've sort of stated why the change has been made. Likewise in this one, earthquake risk amendment, material definition. So they've redefined what sort of materials are acceptable. Notice that they're going for polyethylene, which is more flexible and more able to withstand an earthquake. They found that the concrete pipes that they had and the UPVC were breaking during the earthquake, so they've gone almost entirely to polyethylene, which is more resistant to earthquakes. So that's a modification they made to their infrastructure design standard in response to an earthquake. So to reference standards, you don't have to take the whole standard and do a cut and paste and put it into the contract document. All you have to do is reference it, and you along the same lines here. So the following standards and codes of practice are listed. So by listing this, all of those parts that are in each one of those standards now become part of that contract agreement. That can cause problems and cause conflicts, because you might have one standard saying one thing and one standard saying another thing. So it's best to reference specific sections of standards, but that's not what's done usually. So let's look how this works. So here's an extract from technical specification of the tender document for the Jackman Avenue. The following standards shall be referred to. So it has all of these standards, and there are a whole lot more referenced. So let's look at a particular one, NZS 2032, talking about UPVC pipe systems, the pipes that are carrying wastewater and water. By referencing this, they've just referenced this whole New Zealand standard, and you can see that this is just part of the index. So it includes quite a lot of stuff about UPVC pipes. So this line here means that all of the stuff contained in this document is now part of the contract agreement. So let's look at a different part of it. So let's look at, say, section 4 about flange joints or solvent cement joints, and it tells you all about the procedure for jointing solvent cement joints. So you can see that this is a method specification because it's been specified by the manufacturer. There's a specific way that they want contractors to do these joints between UPVC pipes. So you can see that just that one little line there brings in this whole document, and this whole document includes a whole lot of really specific statements like the one shown here. So these conditions and everything else are now part of that contract agreement.